10-year-old girl reached a doorway she'd walked through 100 times before, and this time a hand went up to stop her. Her own brother kept moving past the same threshold into the same room without so much as a glance back. Within minutes, another woman crossed that same room, laid her palm flat on an empty chair, and made it clear nobody was touching it. And the strange twist in all of this, the person who'd ordered the girl turned away wasn't the king, wasn't the future king either. It was Camilla acting entirely on her own authority. Stick around and hit subscribe before we go further, because the way this actually unfolded gets stranger the deeper you go. Let's rebuild it from where it truly started. Princess Charlotte arrived at a formal royal banquet that evening, fully expecting to slide into the seat beside her brother George, the way she'd done at countless other functions. Instead, a senior attendant intercepted her quietly at the entrance and, without much explanation, made clear she wasn't getting through. Strange enough on its own. What made it sting was what happened one step behind her. George just kept walking. Nobody so much as slowed him down. Same night, same family, same event, and only one sibling got turned back. Charlotte didn't push back or make a scene. You could watch the anticipation drain out of her posture in real time as she glanced toward George, still gliding forward without incident, and started silently running through what she might have done wrong. A staff member offered some vague line about her being too young for this particular gathering, which fell apart instantly given that George, barely older than his sister, was already seated inside. News reached Catherine within minutes, and her response wasn't loud or frantic. If anything, it was almost unsettlingly composed. She asked exactly one question: who authorized this? That single question mattered more than it seemed, because whoever answered it wasn't going to be some junior staffer covering a scheduling slip. This traced back to someone with real weight in the household. She walked straight into the banquet hall, located the chair meant for her daughter, and rested her hand across its back. Told the nearest staff member plainly not to move it. Conversations in the room actually paused. In that instant, this stopped being a logistics hiccup and became something else, a very public standoff between two of the most senior women in the family, with a child still waiting outside. Charlotte, meanwhile, remained stuck by the door, and the person who'd given the order that put her there wasn't going to be easy to overrule. Not because the order was well-reasoned, but because of exactly who had issued it. What Catherine would soon learn about the source of that instruction was something nobody standing in that corridor could have predicted. To understand why a seating arrangement carried this much weight, you have to understand what a royal banquet actually is. It's not a casual family dinner, it's a formal state occasion filled with diplomats, senior officials, and national figures. In that setting, where a person sits or whether they're seated at all functions is a public statement about their standing in the family hierarchy. So when Charlotte's name disappeared from that list, it wasn't only awkward for a child. To every onlooker, it read as a verdict that someone senior had decided her position in the family's future wasn't worth defending. And in an institution built on optics and precedent, that kind of message doesn't fade after one evening. People remember. Here's how the mechanics actually work. Camilla, as the person overseeing the domestic side of these events, genuinely does control much of the real logistics, guest arrangement, table placement, positioning. That's a legitimate part of her role, so technically adjusting a name on a chart isn't automatically scandalous. Except there was a catch. Decisions specifically touching William and Catherine's children were supposed to sit entirely outside her jurisdiction. William had already established a private understanding with senior household staff. Anything concerning George, Charlotte, or Louis required direct sign-off from him, or Catherine never left to general event planning. The moment Camilla made this call by herself, she wasn't merely rearranging seats. She was crossing a line that had already been drawn, whether she wanted to acknowledge it or not. Catherine's reaction wasn't excessive. She wasn't defending furniture. She was defending an agreement that had quietly been ignored. That ignored boundary is exactly where this entire situation began. The real origin point wasn't the banquet at all. It traced back weeks earlier to a much smaller rehearsal ahead of a diplomatic reception at Windsor. That's the moment worth examining closely, because the warning signs were already there. Charlotte had been placed beside George in the receiving line, the row where royals greet arriving guests in order. A modest, age-appropriate role, nothing dramatic. Camilla objected almost immediately, instructing an aide to shift Charlotte further down, arguing the young princess was drawing too much prominence for her age and that George should stand closer to senior family members without his sister right beside him. Catherine arrived at the rehearsal, saw the change had already been executed, and calmly asked who'd moved her daughter. Then she simply restored the original placement. No raised voice, no confrontation. She told the coordinator flatly that nothing involving Charlotte was to be adjusted without one of her parents' approval, and the staff complied instantly without hesitation. Camilla felt that shift. You didn't need her to say a word to understand what it meant. Household staff had just watched her instruction get overturned, then fallen in line behind Catherine instead. That's not simply an uncomfortable rehearsal. That's a household quietly signaling whose word actually carries weight. There's a detail from an aide's written account of that period, claiming Camilla remarked that Charlotte needed to learn that popularity doesn't dictate hierarchy. That comment wasn't really about a receiving line. It pointed to something older, a fear that public attention was drifting somewhere Camilla no longer controlled, with a 10-year-old becoming its symbol. Charlotte had no idea any of this was unfolding above her. She simply apologized to Catherine afterward for causing a problem, a child already absorbing blame for a conflict that belonged entirely to the adults around her. Camilla had lost that round quietly. She wasn't going to let the next one slip the same way. After Windsor, something shifted in Camilla. No public statement, no immediate retaliation, but she began watching for an opening where she'd hold full control without anyone able to walk in and reverse it on the spot. The banquet delivered exactly that. Unlike the rehearsal, this event fell entirely under her oversight: guest order, internal seating, the whole domestic framework of the night. Nobody would be present during the actual planning stage to catch a last-minute change. That mattered. Give her this much credit. Strategically speaking, this wasn't impulsive. She let weeks pass, let the Windsor embarrassment fade, and selected the one event where her control over logistics was cleanest and hardest to dispute on paper. That same written account, the one referencing popularity and hierarchy, makes clear this was never really about protocol. It was about control, about proving to herself as much as anyone that she still held final say over who belonged in a room. Look at it from her position and the logic almost tracks. She's the queen, having spent years building her place inside a family that hadn't exactly welcomed her warmly. Watching a 10-year-old quietly become the public's favorite while her own standing within the household seemed to erode, that's a genuine threat, even if her response to it was completely misguided. What she miscalculated was assuming authority over banquet logistics extended to overriding an agreement William had already put in place. That gap between what she actually controlled and what she assumed she controlled was about to collapse on her very publicly. The night before the banquet, Camilla made her move quietly, no announcement, no discussion. She personally struck Charlotte's name from the final seating plan, set the pen down, then instructed that no replacement chair be placed anywhere near George, not repositioned, removed entirely. What's genuinely unsettling looking back is how she did it. Not in a meeting, not in front of witnesses, not in any way that left an obvious paper trail with her name attached at the top. She handled it late alone, letting the exclusion simply happen without publicly owning the decision in the moment. That detail matters because it suggests she already suspected this wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. If she genuinely believed this fell within her authority, there'd have been no reason to slip it through quietly the night before rather than through the standard process weeks in advance with proper sign-off. Her bet was simple. By the time anyone noticed, Charlotte would already have been turned away at the door. The moment already completed, and reversing it publicly would look messier than letting it stand. She was wagering that a finished humiliation would be harder to undo than a plan still sitting on paper. For a few hours, that bet appeared to be working. Charlotte showed up prepared and eager, ready to demonstrate she could handle the responsibilities that come with the younger generation stepping into more public duties, with no idea the decision against her had already been made the night before. Camilla believed her authority over domestic arrangements would shield the decision once executed. What she hadn't accounted for was Catherine walking into that hall not to ask permission, but as someone who had already decided this wasn't going to be resolved quietly. Camilla assumed the story ended the moment Charlotte was turned away. She had no idea what was coming. Everything flips the moment Catherine enters the banquet hall and heads straight for the head table, where Camilla stands surrounded by guests and officials with no idea what's about to happen. Catherine doesn't come in quietly. She demands directly that the order be reversed. Camilla refuses outright, insisting the decision is final, that royal occasions operate on rank rather than emotion, and that Charlotte needs to understand the difference. If this had genuinely gone through proper channels, that might have settled it, but it hadn't, and Catherine already held the one piece of information that dismantled the entire argument. She'd already spoken with William only minutes earlier. He told her directly this never came from him. He'd never approved removing Charlotte from anything. Instantly, Camilla could no longer frame this as a shared family decision. It was hers alone. Then it worsened further. A senior official quietly confirmed right there that the king's office had received no request to alter Charlotte's attendance. Charles hadn't signed off. Charles hadn't even known. The single person in the hierarchy who could have made this legitimate had no idea it was happening. Camilla had spent weeks building toward this moment, convinced her authority over the banquet's logistics provided sufficient cover. In roughly 90 seconds in front of guests and staff, that entire justification evaporated. Neither the king nor the future king had approved any of it. Camilla reached for the chair, instructing an attendant to remove it. Catherine got there firsthand, flat against its back. "It stays. My daughter stays." That was the moment the balance of power in that room shifted publicly, precisely in front of the people Camilla had needed to believe still answered to her. She'd lost the room, and she still didn't realize this wasn't going to stay contained to a single banquet hall. Once Catherine secured the chair, she didn't stop there, and this is the sharpest part of her response. Charlotte was brought inside immediately, seated beside George exactly as originally planned. No further negotiation. It was simply done. She handled it without turning it into a spectacle, no lecture aimed at Camilla, no speech in front of the guests. She simply told her quietly but firmly that no future decision touching her children would happen again without both parents' direct approval. One sentence. And that single sentence did more damage to Camilla's standing than any public confrontation could have managed. Consider what that actually represented, not an emotional outburst, but a permanent structural shift in how decisions get made, delivered calmly in real time by someone clearly not asking for permission to say it. That kind of move sticks because there's nothing left to argue against afterward. It had already happened. Charlotte took her seat beside George and tellingly didn't turn the moment into anything at all. No triumphant glance toward Camilla, no visible relief. Just composure, as though she'd spent her whole life being prepared for exactly this kind of pressure. Catherine didn't celebrate either. She stayed near her daughter for the remainder of the evening, present without hovering, making sure Charlotte understood she wasn't alone. But she deliberately avoided turning it into a public victory over Camilla restraint. That's a large part of why the move landed as hard as it did. Nobody watching could accuse her of making a scene because she genuinely hadn't. Camilla finished the night with practiced composure on the surface, but everyone in that room had just watched her authority get overruled in real time by someone who never even raised her voice. The chair issue was resolved. What happened to Camilla's standing afterward was only beginning. The next morning, Camilla attempted to recover ground, and the method she chose says a great deal about how she was actually processing the previous night. Rather than reflect, she went after the staff member who'd let Charlotte through, demanding formal disciplinary action for disobeying her instruction. Her logic wasn't entirely irrational from where she sat. An employee had watched her order get openly disregarded in front of guests, and if nothing happened to that person, the rest of the staff would learn her instructions were optional. To her mind, punishment restored discipline. It tracked on paper. Charles saw it differently. Reading the written account alone in his private sitting room, one line stopped him cold. Charlotte had reportedly asked whether she should simply go home to avoid causing further trouble. Not the seating dispute itself. That single question coming from a child was what actually changed things for him. Camilla arrived expecting support and the punishment to proceed. Instead, Charles slid the unsigned disciplinary order back across the desk and told her plainly that the original exclusion had never been properly authorized to begin with, meaning the staff member hadn't disobeyed a valid instruction at all. There was nothing to punish. She pushed back, arguing Catherine had undermined her standing in front of the household. He answered that Charlotte should never have been placed in that position in the first place. For the first time in this entire episode, Charles had picked a side after weeks of staying out of it. William then introduced the structural piece, a formal new household rule requiring both parents' approval for any decision involving George, Charlotte, or Louis. Charles accepted it without objection, quietly but permanently, narrowing how much Camilla could act unilaterally going forward. Camilla left that meeting with no punishment secured and considerably less authority than she'd walked in with. And she wasn't the only one about to discover how public this had already become. While all of this played out behind closed doors, a photograph from the banquet was already circulating, and from the palace's perspective, it was the wrong one. Not the ceremony, not the guests, none of the polished images they'd have preferred, just Charlotte's empty chair captured before Catherine walked in and fixed it. The palace press office tried getting ahead of the story, describing it publicly as a last-minute adjustment involving younger royals' attendance, vague, deliberately soft language, no mention of Camilla whatsoever. For about a day that might have worked, except George had never been excluded. Only Charlotte had. The explanation didn't actually explain anything, and people noticed quickly. Guests who'd been present began sharing their own accounts with reporters, confirming Charlotte had arrived fully prepared, expecting her assigned seat, and only got in after Catherine personally intervened. Within roughly a day, the official version collapsed under its own contradictions. What's genuinely interesting is how the public interpreted it, not as a breach of protocol on Catherine's part, but as protection. One newspaper ran the empty chair on its front page beneath the headline, "A place denied then restored." People began gathering outside Kensington Palace with handwritten signs reading simply that Charlotte belongs. A private family dispute had become something the entire country was watching. Camilla watched the coverage alone, and that was likely the moment it truly landed. Nobody out there saw what she'd done as maintaining order. They saw a grown woman using her authority against a child and a mother stepping in to stop it. Not the story she wanted, and no press release was going to fix it now. The palace could manage the paperwork. It couldn't manage what a single photograph had already told an entire nation. Eventually, Catherine and Camilla met alone, no aides, no officials, no messages relayed through third parties. Catherine had requested it herself, unwilling to let the dispute get handled through written notes while everyone involved was still angry. Camilla entered defensively, accusing Catherine of humiliating her in front of guests and undermining her authority before the entire household. Catherine didn't raise her voice or get pulled into that framing. She simply stated that the humiliation began the moment Charlotte was stopped at the door, not when someone finally challenged the order that put her there. Camilla kept steering the conversation toward protocol and what happened inside the hall. Catherine kept returning it to what had happened to a child outside it. And eventually, arguably, the most important moment in this entire story, Camilla admitted what had really been driving all of it. She confessed she was afraid Charlotte's role was expanding too quickly, afraid a future court was already quietly forming around William and Catherine, with her own position fading in the middle of it. That wasn't a defense of anything. It was fear finally spoken aloud. Catherine's response essentially ended the conflict. Authority doesn't strengthen itself by making itself smaller against a child. It weakens. It becomes easier for others to question. Camilla offered no grand emotional apology, but she agreed right there to stop making independent decisions involving any of William and Catherine's children going forward. No particular warmth in it, but a genuine concession from someone who clearly doesn't concede easily. The private confrontation was over. What remained was whatever came next for Charlotte, for the household, and for Camilla's place within it. Step back from all of it, and here's what the story actually comes down to. Princess Charlotte kept her seat at that banquet, but that was never really the point. The real story is what it took to get there and what it revealed about everyone involved. Catherine established a boundary that couldn't quietly be walked back. Camilla discovered in the most public way imaginable that royal authority doesn't hold up once it's visibly turned against a child. It collapses fast, taking credibility down with it. Charles was forced to choose fairness over his own wife's version of events, clearly an uncomfortable position, and he made that choice anyway. William walked away with a permanent structural safeguard protecting his children from anything like this happening again. Charles gave Charlotte something quietly meaningful afterward, telling her directly that she'd done nothing wrong, that the fault belonged entirely to the adults who'd allowed her to get caught in their disagreement. That detail matters most because a 10-year-old had spent an entire evening privately wondering whether she'd somehow caused all of it herself. Catherine never turned this into a victory lap over Camilla. She emerged from it, not as someone who defeated a rival, but as a mother who protected her daughter, and in doing so displayed exactly the composure expected of a future queen. That restraint is precisely what made the moment land as hard as it did. Camilla kept her title. Nothing about that changed. But she walked away with a very clear understanding of where that title's limits actually sit, and she accepted the new boundaries whether she welcomed them or not. At the next formal event, Charlotte walks toward her assigned seat, glances at Catherine, receives one small nod in return, and nobody stops her. No official intervenes, no chair gets moved. That image is essentially the entire verdict of this story. You don't build a stable family or a stable monarchy by making children absorb the cost of adult power struggles. That's not a family disagreement. That's simply what happens when authority forgets exactly who it's supposed to protect.